This video focuses on the checks that the judicial branch has against the executive branch. Like anything else, the Supreme Court has the ability, just like they do with laws passed by Congress, to determine if they're constitutional or not. They have the ability to determine whether or not what the president is doing or what members of the executive branch are doing is constitutional or not. As you can see in the cartoon, presidents don't have limitless power, and that's largely because the Supreme Court can prevent that from happening. So we're very quickly going to look at a few cases that sort of protect presidential power. These were cases that ruled in favor of something the president is able to do, and in some cases either protected the power the president already had or expanded the power of the president. So the first case is Myers versus United States. This was a case involving a dispute involving the president on the screen, Woodrow Wilson, and we've already talked about this year that presidents have to get Senate approval in order to appoint a cabinet official. That if you nominate your Secretary of Education, the Senate has to approve that. This question or court case involved the question on whether or not presidents needed permission from the Senate to remove those officials for some reason. And the Supreme Court said the case is no, that a president does need approval to give a cabinet member a job, but does not need Senate approval to remove that person for some reason if they're not happy with the job that that person is doing. The second case is Korematsu versus United States. This involved a controversial action taken during World War II, and it involved one of President Franklin Roosevelt's executive orders that established internment camps for Japanese American citizens living on the West Coast. Roosevelt essentially put this into place because he felt like he was protecting the United States, and his concern was that you wouldn't be able to tell essentially a loyal Japanese American citizen from a potential Japanese spy. So Japanese Americans on the West Coast were essentially detained for the duration of World War II. This was challenged, and the Supreme Court essentially agreed or allowed this to go into effect, right? That didn't strike down the internment camps, essentially saying that presidents have the ability in times of war to go a little bit further in protecting the country. And that while this might not be permissible during times of peace, an action like this is permissible during times of war, and then essentially this increased presidential power during times of war. And then in the case of Nixon versus Fitzgerald in 1982, this essentially meant that, or established that presidents are immune from any kind of prosecution during their time in office. So that if you are negatively impacted as a U.S. citizen by something the president does, you can't directly sue the president or prosecute the president for that. So again, it kind of protects the president from prosecution criminally or even civilly during the course of the time in which they are president. You could sue the country, but you can't either sue or prosecute the president individually. And then there are a handful of cases that restrict presidential power. So for example, in the 1952 case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, this involved President Truman at the time taking over the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, which produced valuable war materials. The Korean War is going on at the time, and workers within this factory go out on strike, and the factory is unable to continue to make the materials that the government was using for its war effort. So Truman ordered government officials to basically take over this private business and to continue to keep it open, production open. And the Supreme Court decided that even during times of war, presidents cannot take over private businesses, right? That you just can't commandeer a business for the government. So this restricted presidential power a bit. In the case of U.S. versus Nixon in 1974, this related to when we talked about the idea of Watergate and President Nixon allegedly authorizing people that worked under him to break into the Watergate Hotel, which was located in Washington, D.C., because that is where the Democratic headquarters was. Nixon was a Republican, and he allegedly authorized people that worked for him to break into his sort of competitor's office to be able to take some of their files, to be able to put listening devices on their phones, and individuals were caught and it was rumored that Nixon was implicated in this. But as they began to do more investigation, Nixon claimed executive privilege when people began to ask what his role was in this break-in. And essentially the Supreme Court decided in 1974 that presidents can use executive privilege. Like, it is a thing, it's real. Sometimes there are necessary circumstances in which a president needs to not tell everybody, Congress and the citizens, what is happening. But that in no circumstance should executive privilege ever be used to cover up like personal criminal misconduct that the president is himself involved in. So this limits the president's ability to use executive privilege. The case of Train versus City of New York in 1975 involved the question of whether or not a president could approve a budget, but then simply not spend money within the budget that he sort of disagreed with. And the Supreme Court in this case ruled that no, a president can't do that. That if a president signs the budget into law, he has to spend all like money that was approved. You can't sign the budget into law and then just decide at a protest that even though he signed the budget, he's not going to spend certain like aspects of money that Congress approved. So all of the budget has to be spent if the president's going to sign it. If not, the president can veto the budget and Congress can develop a new one. The 1998 case of Clinton versus City of New York involves what's called the line item veto. Presidents up to this time, some had tried to veto only small sections of bills that Congress proposed, so that you might allow some of the bill to go into effect, but then you would veto some of the bill. And the Supreme Court in 1998 ruled that the idea of like vetoing only a small portion of a bill and approving the rest, that's called a line item veto, is like a partial approval and a partial veto is an unconstitutional use of a president's veto power. Because if you selectively veto certain sections of a congressional bill, you really can change what Congress's intention was regarding that bill. So much like the budget, you either have to sign the whole law into effect or you have to veto the entire thing, and then Congress can work on the sections that you don't like. But you can't approve part of a bill and then veto part of a bill. And then the last one is Hamsdan versus Rumsfeld. This is 2005. This challenge involved what was going on during this time period were the early years, the war on terrorism, the war in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and the United States government was implicated in essentially torturing suspected terrorists that were being held on a U.S. military base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. And whether or not the United States government, led by President Bush at the time, could engage in these tactics, or whether or not these suspected terrorists that were being detained were entitled to the same protections that American citizens would be, which is obviously protections from things like torture because of the guarantee you have against cruel and unusual punishment within the Bill of Rights. That's the Eighth Amendment. And the Supreme Court basically ruled that non-citizens under U.S. custody are entitled to many of the same rights as full-blown American citizens, and this very much limited sort of these actions of torture that were being directed against suspected terrorists at the time. So these are some examples of court cases that involve presidential power. The first few sort of like protected presidential power, and the more recent cases that we went over sort of like challenged presidential power.